This Thursday marks the 30th anniversary of the 1995 referendum. All week, we're taking a look back. Now, we came close to losing this country, but in the end, the No camp won the referendum with a 50.58% share of the vote compared to 49.42% for the yes side. But over the last 3 decades, how have Quebecers' attitudes changed towards separation and federalism? And could the future see another separatist movement with enough support to win a referendum? Let's go now to Sebastien Dallaire, Executive Vice President of Eastern Canada. For Léger, he's on the line. Monsieur Dallaire, Sebastien, welcome to the program.
Always a pleasure.
Listen, we're looking back all week on the show. I guess I got to start off with this. What were you up to in 1995? Take me back to your October of 1995.
Well, back then I was quite young, like the early parts of my socialization into politics, and I remember it being very emotional. It was a divisive period with people across Quebec having tough conversations and, pretty much half of the province being hopeful, the other half being afraid on the night of the referendum. So it was a very emotionally charged environment for sure.
Do you think that's part of the reason you ended up in the career you chose? Because you grew up living through a night like that and a night where the numbers mattered so much?
I think it did. It certainly did play a role. I was heavily involved into studying politics, went to university in politics, and kept going, looking at potentially a career in academia because of all of this. So yes, it's very much shaped me into who I am and trying to understand both sides of key issues.
And over the last 3 decades, we've seen ebbs and flows, highs and lows when it comes to the separatist cause and what the polling suggests. Why don't you take us through the last few decades here? What have you noted as a pollster? What strikes you about how Quebecers' views, attitudes have changed over the decades?
Mm-hmm. So what we have seen, if we look all the way back to what happened prior to 1995 and up to today, what we see is moments where support for sovereignty really go up and goes up above 50%, and at some points reached almost 60%, is when we have national crises that make some Quebec voters feel like they're not being understood, that they're not part of the national discussion, or and we can think of things like the failure of the Meech Lake Accord. A lot of Quebecers viewed this as a rejection of Quebec's traditional demands. And you had the Charlottetown Accord, which also failed in another referendum in 1992. And all these debates led to the 1995 really, really close call. And then when we look what happened after, support for sovereignty also ebbed and flows. And for many years after that, it stayed close to 50%, went above 50% when Lucien Bouchard became the premier of Quebec after the referendum, then went down below 50. And the last time it climbed up to upper 50s in favor of the yes side was during the Gomery Commission, so the sponsorship scandal, which brought back a lot of memories about what had happened during the referendum campaign. And again, just stirring up emotions, strong nationalist sentiment in Quebec. But since that time, what we've seen is kind of a plateauing, a few ebbs and flows here and there, but generally speaking, support for sovereignty in recent years has been in the mid-30s and has been fairly steady. So you have still support for independence, but what has happened is we didn't really have collectively as Quebecers another real discussion over what it would mean, why would it still be relevant now, what would be the key pillars of a sovereigntist movement. All those discussions haven't really existed over the past 30 years. So younger Quebecers have never had to ask themselves how they feel about it when we think about this. It's always been very theoretical. Never really happened. If you're under 40, under 45, you never had to ask yourself that question.
Yeah. And I do want to ask you something about young Quebecers in particular. But before I get there, I want to know if you've looked back at the polling data from the last 3 decades and if you've seen a moment where there was everything in the right place, like a political party that would have gone for a referendum, and like Quebecers' attitudes. In the last 30 years, has there been any moment where maybe a political party should have pulled the trigger on another referendum, or have the winning conditions just not been there, whether it comes to the political aspects and the public support?
It would have been around the Gomery Commission, the time of the Gomery Commission after the sponsorship scandal. This would have been the only period where support was very strong, and maybe sovereignty could have been achievable at that point. But since then, we haven't seen really strong moments, simply because discussions over Quebec's inclusion in the Constitution, should we try again to have another round of negotiations to change the Constitution, all those questions have kind of died down, or they've been on the back burner, and whether at the federal level or the provincial level, nobody really tried to raise them again. And even the Parti Québécois, the last few times they were in power, a referendum and sovereignty, yes, it was always part of their platform, but it wasn't, really on the front burner or something that they had promised if they won the election. This is likely to change next year. We'll see how it goes, but if the PQ remains in the lead and they maintain their position that they want a referendum in the first term, this will become very real for voters for the first time in 30 years. With
Sebastien Dallaire, Executive Vice President of Eastern Canada for Léger. So, Sebastien, on that point, Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon and his Parti Québécois doing well in the polls. And then there's been a couple of polls, and I don't know where Léger has counted itself among those polls, that has shown that perhaps among younger Quebecers, there may be a changing of opinions and maybe more interest in the separatist cause. What have you seen on that front? How important is the youth movement part? How important is the youth movement to the separatist cause?
Well, typically movements to create something new, to change the old system, it tends to come from younger generations. And this was the case in 1980 and 1985, where younger Francophone Quebecers were really pushing for this. And in recent years, what we had seen is that it was mostly older Quebecers who had gone through either 1995 or in some cases 1995 and 1980, who were really at the forefront of the push for another referendum. And what we saw in recent months was somewhat of an uptick among young people. Yes, there was, late June, early July, a stronger movement among younger people where all of a sudden they became more favorable towards sovereignty than older Quebecers, which was the first time since 1995 that we had measured this. But it seemed to be more of a blip, maybe related to celebrations of the life of Serge Fiori when he passed away, combined with La Fête Nationale. There was a lot of cultural effervescence around Quebec and what it meant to be Quebecer, Quebec cultural engagement, and that seems to have created an uptick. Since then, it has gone down a little bit, but what we are seeing now is basically young Quebecers are just as favorable towards sovereignty as older Quebecers. So it has leveled out. So right now it's kind of a level playing field, which is relatively new. It's only in recent past. And what we're seeing is there was a bit of a downtick among older Quebecers that happened at the same time as the little uptick among younger Quebecers. And what we are seeing is maybe older Quebecers seeing that the current economic environment is not fantastic. There's a lot of uncertainty. There are some concerns over what could happen to Quebec, to Canada, because of what's happening with the United States, tariffs. And for younger Quebecers, maybe it feels a little bit more like a time for change. If things are not working well, maybe it's time to think something new, try something new, and that may be what we're measuring. So a little bit down among older Quebecers, a little bit up among younger Quebecers.
Well, that's the one thing I'll take away from our segment, is that it certainly seems to have to do support for separation There's all these external things. You mentioned Meech Lake or the Gomery and sponsorship scandal, or now it's Donald Trump. A lot of people are saying that's good for the federal cause if we've got a threat from Donald Trump as well. So it's interesting how that plays out. I have to leave it there, Sebastien. I want to thank you so much for coming on this morning.
My pleasure.
Sebastien Dallaire is Executive Vice President of Eastern Canada for Leger.
I'm Dylan Playfair.
And I'm Tyler Smith.
We're putting loneliness in the penalty box by talking to some of our favorite athletes about the importance of friendship.
This is Bromance.
Bromance is brought to you by Charm Diamond Centers, proudly Canadian-owned and operated. Charm has been part of your love stories and bromances for over 50 years. And you can find Bromance on the iHeartRadio network or wherever you get your podcasts.